So first and foremost, huge shout out, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Undergraduate Library. We're down here in their podcast studio, in their space. It's awesome. It enables us to do this. It's really, really cool. Second, I'd have to give a huge shout out to our sponsors, the Science Policy Action Network, or SPAN Inc. Very briefly. The Science Policy Action Network is North Carolina's premier scientific consulting firm specializing in education, health, and innovation. In this rapidly changing world, companies, organizations, educational institutions are really trying to figure out how to navigate this space, whether it's artificial intelligence or social media or operating during a pandemic. The Science Policy Action Network is here to help you navigate these spaces and also advocate for your work in the spaces of policymakers and so on and so forth. If you want more information, check us out at span-inc.org. That's SPAN-inc.org. But let's get right into it. William, what do you go by?
You can call me Will.
Will is a radio personality by night and by day. He is a researcher here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Will, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to be your first guest.
Yeah. Well, so I first saw you at the Carolina Science Cafe, and like I said, you absolutely crushed it, right?
Thank you.
I think people take for granted, science communication. They feel like you can just do the research, and the research just speaks for itself. But you got up there in front of people there at the restaurant to see your talk, but also you had to kind of entertain the likes of people just coming in, grabbing a beer, grabbing something to eat, and they're like, wait, hold on, what's an aerosol? So I guess we'll start right there. Like, what is an aerosol?
Oh, well, yeah, great. I'm glad you were there, and thanks for being there. And yeah, I mean, I get a lot of energy out of those kinds of things. So, talking with folks, and especially folks who are really genuinely interested in the science and want to learn more, I really get a lot out of it for me. So I get a lot of energy from the audience. So you asked the question, what is an aerosol? And, folks hear about aerosols. Some folks think about those cans, think about the hairspray, all sorts of things that we think of when we think about aerosols. But scientifically, what we define an aerosol as is a liquid or solid suspended in the air. So if it's in the atmosphere and it's not a gas, we consider it an aerosol. So smoke, haze, fog, all those things, pollen, all of those fall under what we call aerosols.
And I'm imagining it's mainly because we, have to breathe air, and basically everything in the air, whether it's aerosolized, we're inhaling that, and it has impacts on our overall health. And you talk about that a little bit. I remember you saying something about that during your Carolina Science Cafe talk. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the health implications of breathing in those aerosols are massive. It's been estimated 6 to 8 million people die prematurely worldwide just by breathing in these aerosols. Sometimes we call them particulate matter, or PM. That's the same term as aerosols. That word can be used interchangeably. And so sometimes you see regulations are PM regulations. That's also regulating aerosols. And so folks who are exposed to particulate matter, especially the small ones, has been shown 6 to 8 million people, and 90% of those deaths are in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, let's back up a little bit. So, you're a little kid, you're interested in a lot of things. Music is one of them, I guess. Science is another thing. But what was the switch that went off within you that said, I'm going to study particulate matter. I'm going to study aerosols. Like, I don't really see that trajectory occur a lot. You get a chance to sit in front of some kids, and you're just like, what are you going to be when you grow up? They're like, I'm going to be an astronaut. I'm going to be the president. I'm going to be an attorney, a doctor. But, you were like, well, I am going to be somebody who researches aerosols and particulate matter. What was that switch? How'd you get into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, my family's from Guatemala and Ecuador, and so I remember vividly as a kid visiting my family in Guatemala City and smelling, at the time, what I didn't know, and it was like a sweet smell, and so that's diesel exhaust I was smelling, that aromatics that comes from diesel. And that always brings me back the memories of my childhood and fond memories. But later on, I would find out that stuff isn't actually very good for anyone. And then, when I was growing up, I always liked to solve problems, right? I think I'm an engineer by nature, and so I like to solve problems, and I like to use science to solve problems. And then I also enjoy chemistry, so I wanted to use chemistry to solve problems. And then when I was looking around, I saw that air pollution is a huge public health issue, right? And that's a problem worthy tackling, right? And so I feel good about working about that. And then I find out that a lot of air pollution is made via chemistry, and so that's checks the box there. And then I came to find out that they are building these huge computer models that simulate all that chemistry in the atmosphere, and then we're using those tools to solve those problems, and that's how I became hooked.
Wow. So, you were talking about growing up as a kid, being exposed to these aerosols, these particulates, these diesel particulates. Now when you kind of look across the world, look across the United States, you said low-income communities, but low-income communities are right next to high-income communities, so on and so forth, right? Is there any kind of carryover? I mean, one of the things that I always see the struggle being is that because these are low-income communities, we just don't have to care about them, right? So talk about a little bit about, like, do aerosols stay in one place? Is it just a cloud that just sits over some communities and doesn't affect others? Or is it something that affects one community, it might affect us all?
Right,
you see where I'm going with
No,
that?
yeah, no. Pollution knows no boundaries. It knows no national boundaries. It knows no community boundaries. A great example of that is the wildfires. Right, we all were exposed to wildfire smoke. Most of us, a lot of us in this country, especially if you live in the California and even here in North Carolina, we were exposed to that. So you can't move away from that, right? You can't live in an affluent community away from industrial centers. You're still impacted by wildfire smoke, and so that's a great example of how. It doesn't care who it affects all of us. And I think that has brought a lot of attention to climate change and these issues when everyone is affected by it, right? I mean, historically, if you look at our responses in environmental regulations, it's usually in response to some big crisis, heavy smog happening in LA, lakes catching on fire, those sorts of responses to those things. And maybe this wildfire is that kind of, that trigger that finally has us kind of start to respond to that sort of thing. But, I also want to mention that, there is true, however, that there is a disproportional impact on poorer communities, and that's just a fact. We have cleaner air overall here in the United States. We have some of the cleanest air in the world, in fact. Us in Western Europe are really blessed to have this, and that's the result of clean air regulations. But it's not distributed evenly across the country, and there's still areas that are still experiencing very high levels of pollution, and most of those folks are poor communities.
Well, okay, so are you able to put some kind of names on these communities? Like, what, in the United States, for example, what area of the United States is impacted, most by these particulate matters, right? Is there a community, can you look and say, all right, Chapel Hill, I'm not saying Chapel Hill, but just an example. Chapel Hill has, the highest, PM concentration out of, the triangle cities. What city in the U.S., I heard you mention Los Angeles, what city in the United States is most impacted by PM?
Right, so you have all kinds of exposures here. So let's just talk about North Carolina. So in North Carolina, you have eastern North Carolina, where you have contained animal feeding operations that are industrial size, that are producing aerosols from the lagoons, from the way that they dispose of the hog waste, for example.
You can smell it.
Right, you can smell it, right? That's the gases that you smell, but they also produce aerosols. And then you have, natural aerosols that occur. For example, you have algae blooms that are happening in North Carolina coast. Those produce toxic aerosols that go into the atmosphere. PFAS is Gen X, is one of those forever chemicals. They're actually aerosolized and put into the atmosphere and then are raining down on us as well. So those are all exposures. And now you want to ask what's the dirtiest city? And so those are the major metropolitan cities, right? There's obviously the big one. But that's a different kind of aerosol, right? And so that's the thing about aerosols. Everyone has some sort of exposure depending on where you live and what sources are there and what chemistry is happening in the atmosphere. That's why it's such a complex thing to kind of figure out.
Yeah. I mean, are we at the worst time right now for aerosols? I mean, a lot of times people, like my granddad, back in my day, you could just take in a nostril full of air and you just knew that it was just good, clean air, right? Because we didn't have all these automobiles. But, are the times we living in cleaner air or dirtier air? I mean...
Oh, right. So that's a great question, right? Yeah. And so, the Environmental Protection Agency is the agency that's in charge of protecting our public health and the environment. And they track these things. And if you look overall, as an average, as a country, yes, the trends have been coming down significantly. It's really a great success story. And if you look at the Clean Air Act, it is actually the most lucrative piece of legislation. And what I mean by that is for every dollar that we put into the cost for Clean Air Act, we get multiples of dollars back in benefits. It's a huge rate of return on that piece of legislation, because every reduction that we make in air quality leads to lives being saved, and you can put a dollar amount on those lives, and it's significant, right? Productivity, a lifetime of work, right? And so we've seen significant narrowing down of air pollution. So we could say, in general, that the air is cleaner than your grandparents' day and before them, for sure. But it's not the same everywhere, and that's the average. And that's the issue that we're dealing with now. There are some places now that are probably just as dirty, as some places were 20 years ago, right? It's an uneven distribution of who's being exposed to what.
Well, do you look at the, regular things different now? Like, are you... 4th of July, right? I love 4th of July. It's awesome, right? Fireworks, explosions, right? But now that you are, an expert in, aerosols and PMs, are you now looking at, firework displays and you're just like, oh boy, we're going to be dealing with PMs from this celebration for about a month now? Or does it change the way you look at the world?
Yeah, and in fact, we do see it. Like, if you look at the PM concentrations on those nights, you see them skyrocket at night. Of course, I don't see how it couldn't, right? In my own home, I try not to combust things, right? I don't burn incense. I don't burn candles. I try not to put chemicals into the air, right? I don't aerosolize stuff. But I love my natural gas stove, right? I love it. I know that produces aerosols. But I mitigate that risk. So I have an air filter. I open a window. I ventilate out those aerosols when I'm using my stove, right? I also love to grill, charcoal grill. And so again, I don't let my family outside when I'm starting up that grill. So, stay inside until it's done, right? And then, So I think about it all the time, in fact. It's crazy.
Oh, man. That is like a huge thing for me. As soon as I doing yard work or something like that, if I smell anyone in my neighborhood grilling or cooking out, I have to pull out my grill, right? I have to put something in the air, right? I have to, and I like smoking meat, right? The most smoke possible, and
Me too.
I'm just devastating my neighborhood.
So you got to think about it this way, though, right? So look at the amount of charcoal that you're actually burning, and maybe about a pound and a half, maybe that you're grilling. Mm-hmm. You're going to burn that in coal by watching, binging Netflix. So,
I do both, right? I eat ribs while watching binging a show, right?
So my point is that if everyone stopped grilling, that's not going to impact air quality, right? That's not the major sources of air pollution into the atmosphere. Yeah. And to berate people to have them, not do something they love because it doesn't have a meaningful impact is, I think, wrong. And I think that's a lot of what is happening sometimes when we tell people not to do this, not to do that, and then don't really take into account what the big, impacts are, right? If you look, so that's what I want to say.
No, I don't berate people.
I'm not saying you're berating them, man.
I do berate them for not being good grill masters. But, listen, I bring my whole family over to your house and we're all starving, and then the food you pull off the grill is like, meh, so I berate them. I'm like,
that's not going to happen in my house.
Yeah.
I should mention, I grew up in Missouri, right? And we love barbecue in Missouri, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then I did my graduate work in Texas, and they love some barbecue in Texas,
beef,
right?
Brisket, yeah.
And then I came here, and they love their barbecue. So I've had a great sampling of all the great barbecues of the world, and I've learned what I could.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so let's go back to this kind of longitudinal analysis of, PMs and just basic air quality over time. And you're talking a little bit about legislation, and you're also just talking about kind of this investment in understanding what's going on in the air and how that is profitable, right? Just being honest, what you don't know costs you a lot of money, right?
That's right, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about some of the breakthroughs that have occurred in your field that have led to like the Clean Air Act, changes in legislation, and what kind of discoveries are like happening kind of as we speak that you feel are just going to really just like, shake up the entire field?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what's come out of. So we should step back a second. So when the Clean Air Act was enacted, in it they quickly recognized that pollutions formed in the atmosphere is what we say is nonlinear. It's very complex. And so they recognized that, and they said in the Clean Air Act that you have to use computer simulations of the atmosphere to know whether your policies are going to work or not, because the atmosphere is so complex. But when they wrote that and did that, there were no air quality simulations of the atmosphere. And so they tasked EPA to do that. And UNC Chapel Hill built one of the very first atmospheric chambers. It's actually just south of here in Pittsburgh. Okay. And that data that was generated was used to build the air quality models that we're now using. And so now we have fast forward to today, we are able to simulate these atmospheres, and a lot of that know-how and approach has been used now for climate change research, because we also have to model the atmosphere for climate change. And a lot of the climate change work that relies on aerosols, because aerosols can cool or heat the planet, a lot of the know-how how to produce those aerosols, the chemistry of those aerosols came out of the air quality work. So those are all huge contributions to the field and to all of us. Our ability to know what our air quality is and forecast it and go back, that's all the result of everything that came out of the Clean Air Act and all what we had to do to develop these models.
Yeah, well, what is that like, right, being a researcher and having findings and then trying to convert that then into policy? I mean, policy is hard enough, right? But then trying to use, cutting edge research to then inform policy, that has to be even more difficult. Do you have any experience in that, or are you just,
Oh no, definitely yes.
Okay, talk about that. Talk about your success. I mean, it helps that you are able to communicate your research, so amazingly, right? Talk a little bit about what that experience has been like.
Yeah, sure. So I remember what we were talking earlier. I'm an engineer at heart, so I'm interested in solving problems. I'm not interested in doing innovations in a lab that has no impact for public health. I'm in a school of public health. This is what I do. And so one of the best ways to impact public health is to help and provide science to the policymakers who are making the policy, making the decisions, right? And so since the Clean Air Act says that these policymakers have to use these models, I come in as an expert on the models to make sure those models are actually predicting what they should be predicting. And we're using the data and the analysis to come up with the sources that would be that need to be regulated, that's going to be the most impactful for improving air quality. And so for the last, in fact, my PhD thesis was on this, for the last, 24 years now, I've been working in Houston, Texas. And Houston is the fourth largest city in the United States, but it's also the largest concentration of oil and gas processing facilities in North America. It's also the top 10 world port, and I think the largest railroad hub in North America is all in Houston, Texas, right? And they also have a huge problem with air pollution, ozone in this case. And so what I've been doing for the past 20 years is working both with the oil and gas industry and the state of Texas and providing them scientific data to understand what are the sources and fate of air pollution in Houston and who should be regulated and by how much. And one of the big findings that we found back in the early 2000s when I was working on this was that the oil and gas industry would release large amounts of these chemicals into the atmosphere that would react and form ozone. And so we cracked down on those regulations. And Houston went from the dirtiest city in the country, it was worse than Los Angeles in 2000, to being an attainment of the standard 5, 6, 7 years later. It's really an amazing success story because we focus on those specific kind of releases. Fast forward to today, the standard is lower now, so it's more stricter. Okay. And I'm still focusing on emissions, and we still see, I think there are certain emissions from the oil and gas industry that if we regulated them again, different kinds of sources that we may, again, show attainment in Houston. But it's a hard problem, man.
Yeah. Listen, shout out to Houston, right? This is not what you were talking about, but I love that city. Every time I visit it, I call my wife. I'm like, we're going to have to move to Houston. No, but the Triangle's great. What's the joke about Houston? You got to drive an hour to get to Houston from Houston, right?
Oh, man, yeah. It takes a few hours to get across that city.
Yeah. So what have you seen? So you've impacted standards. You have improved the air quality in Houston. How does that translate into improved health? Are you seeing fewer kind of respiratory-related issues? Are you seeing fewer premature deaths that you previously associated with PMs? Or has that not been, analyzed? Are you not able to show any kind of causation?
Oh, I'm sure we could. I mean, I personally aren't looking into that, but I'm sure folks are.
Right.
I mean, what we can show and see are the concentrations of ozone and what people are being exposed to and what those trends are. And they are going down, right? There used to be large amounts, high ozone exceedances, in Houston, and those are all gone now. And now they're smaller ozone exceedance, but the standards got more stringent, so now they're bumping against the standard again, right? And so, you can see, we know for a fact that ozone in particulate matter leads to negative public health outcomes, and so if you reduce your exposure to those, it's a guaranteed improvement in public health. There's no question.
Right.
There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things, but people breathing in aerosols and people dying, it's pretty clear there's a connection there.
Okay, so you were talking earlier, right? And I'm sorry I didn't ask this before, but, you were talking about in your household, right, some of the things that you do, right? You were talking about filters that you have. Now, obviously, you're thinking about different. So I'm a virologist, right? So my household operated very differently during the pandemic. I have to say that throughout the entire pandemic, no one in my household, came down with COVID.
Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. I sat next to like an esteemed virologist on a flight somewhere, and he, developed COVID, and I just interpreted it as like I must be a better virologist. Right?
That's funny.
I don't know, but I want to kind of go back to you, right? Because I'm going to listen to some of the things you say, and I'm going to start incorporating it into my own lifestyle, right? I mean, you're the expert, right? So you said, while you're grilling, no kids outside until you're done cooking.
Yeah, well, you could do it, especially in the smoking phase, right? When you first start, it's really smoky, right? Until the coals get hot. Yeah. Then once the coals are hot, it's fine. But then I like to do a lot of wood chip smoking, So then there's, all those aerosols have a lot of flavor. Yeah.
They do.
Yeah. And so, you can just have them in the front yard and you grill in the backyard, right? That's kind of what I do.
Now, you were also talking about filters in your house, right? I mean, I got to go to, a home improvement store, purchase filters. What are your thoughts about filters, being inserted into your house? Some people say, get the cheapest filters and then change them more frequently. And other people are like, well, buy the most expensive filters because they're just the best, right? So what are you thinking about?
Right. So, there's all kinds of choices out there. Yeah. And, if you really want a cost-effective, do-it-yourself option, there's a professor, Dr. Corsi, who does indoor air quality. And him and another guy, called, I think Rosen, it's called the Rosen Corsi box.
Okay.
And it's all over social media. And basically you just take 4... those filters that you use for air conditioning, right?
That's right.
And then a box fan,
okay,
right? And you use duct tape,
okay,
and then that is just as effective as $10,000, $1,000 filters for reducing aerosols in your home. So that there are really cheap ways to do it,
yeah,
right? But then you could also, that doesn't maybe look nice, right? So my wife wouldn't let me do that way, and so there are other products. So what you want to look for is, I like to have kind of 2 stages. One is a HEPA filter, right, that takes out all the aerosols, and then I have one that has a little carbon filter on the front that can take out some of the gases as well. And that's what I run. I mean, you want to. There's a lot of literature out there that looks and reviews these things. As with anything, you want to do some homework before you purchase those things. That's what I did.
Yeah, absolutely. Do your homework. Check out the podcast. Right, that's your homework. This is where you learn stuff at. All right. So, what is the big thing? Really, kind of coming up, right? The the most recent breakthrough in your field that you're just like, oh, when people find out about this, it's going to just change the game up? So what's the big breakthrough?
Yeah, so I think, the buzzword right now is artificial intelligence, right? And so how could we use that in this field? And so there are a lot of exciting applications that are happening in this field for air quality that are really can utilize AI. We live in a huge planet with lots of space and time, right? And our measurements and our models don't cover the whole planet. And so we are in a data poor environment when it comes to air quality. And so AI can really help us with that and help us understand these complex sources. And then one of the things that I'm working on right now with collaborators from George Mason University, I want to give them a shout out, is where these air quality models that we run and that we've been talking about actually require supercomputing clusters to run. They're very complex models that require lots of computational power. So what we've been trying to do is create an AI bot that mimics the behavior of these really complex systems, but you could run it on your phone or you could run on your laptop, or you don't need a supercomputing cluster to do it. And if we could and have some success actually for the bot to mimic the behavior of these really complex systems. If we're able to break through with that, then now all of a sudden everyone has the ability to see if that new Buc-ee's that's coming to their community is going to impact their air quality. They don't have to hire a $10,000, $50,000 consultant to run a supercomputing model to do that. They could run this bot. There's still, you still need the technical know-how, but the computational infrastructure is no longer going to be a barrier to allow communities, to allow stakeholders, to allow counties, to allow cities to ask all these questions that we want to know about. And we can't do it because it's such a complex system out there. But if we're able to provide that complex tool at reduced computational cost, I think that'll change the game.
I mean, you also talked about how, trees produce, aerosols, right? And it is a very complicated thing. You both have, aerosols that are naturally produced, and you have, your kind of combustion base. But energy is also changing, right? You've got EVs, right? I mean, vehicles that are not requiring fossil fuels to move around. Now, some people are going to say, well, the electricity that, it powers it. Now, that comes from oftentimes combustion sources. But, you have huge breakthroughs like 2 years ago, Lawrence Livermore Laboratory is talking about nuclear fusion and how you're going to have new energy sources, right? How are these kind of new ways of producing energy and new ways of utilizing energy, how are those going to impact PMs?
So it's going to have a huge impact on public health, right? So if you look at what most of us are exposed to when it comes to air quality, if you like the average American, most of us are exposed to the worst parts of air quality when we're sitting in our car, sucking in exhaust from the cars in front of us and around us. Okay. Being on the highways, being on the roads, those are the highest and worst places for air pollution, right? Now imagine all those combustion sources around you disappear. Now they're all electric sources, right? All of a sudden you've zeroed out all the air quality issues that are around you at the highest amount of exposure that you have. That is the most effective way to improve public health in this country, is to electrify our transportation, passenger fleet. Now, you're also correct in saying that now if you're generating that energy using coal, you're still producing PM, sure. But you know what? It's much easier to control one coal-fired power plant and all the stuff that's coming out of the stack than it is to control 50,000 cars who are all emitting and making sure that they all are maintaining, right? And we can deal with that coal-fired power plant and phase it out eventually, right? But we can get the public health impacts immediately by electrifying the transportation fleet.
So the marketplace plays a huge role so we can make discoveries, but at the end of the day, you're going to have an innovation in the marketplace, such as, electric vehicles that people want, and that is going to change. I mean, I remember when I saw the first, EV, a long time ago. I remember my uncle saying, I would never in my life drive one of those. Nobody's ever going to drive one of those. And now I drop my daughter off to school, and it's like a fleet of electric vehicles, right? And so I think everything's going in, I guess, that direction.
Well, so cool. Asia's coming out with a very inexpensive electric car, and that's going to change everything. It's like I can't remember the price of it, and I can't remember the name of it. Maybe we can look it up later. But it's going to be a very inexpensive electric car, and so that It's going to change things. So all those folks that I was talking about, the 90% of that burden of 68 million feet that happen in low and middle income countries, a large fraction of that is because of transportation, right? The dirtiest cars, the oldest cars, all the cars that the Western world, gets rid of goes to other countries, and they continue to use those. They're also using a fuel that's not as clean, right, as our fuel. So, high sulfur diesel, for example, or high sulfur in this, and that doesn't help either. So if we can get rid of those cars that are burning those fuels, it's going to have a huge impact on public health.
I know you're talking about, geopolitics, right? Resources, air, so on and so forth, and communities globally. You talked about your work in Houston. Are you aware of any work that's going on to address those issues when you're talking about, nations or communities across the world that don't have necessarily the economic resources as, say, for instance, the United States? What work is being done in that regard as far as, air quality, PMs, and aerosols?
Sure. So, it's pretty widely recognized in our community that air quality is an international issue. Yeah. Saharan dust impacts Miami. Chinese pollution impacts California. Mexico emissions impact El Paso, right? Yeah. So, there's lots of international boundaries. And, what happens in biomass burning in Africa impacts what happens here in the United States. And so all those things are really...
Wait, break that down.
Oh, so
how does that happen?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how that impacts us.
Yeah, so a couple of ways. All right, so you have Saharan dust that's flowing out over the ocean. Yeah. And the amount and intensity of that Saharan dust modulates the temperature of those oceans. And the temperature of those oceans determines the intensity and frequency of hurricanes that we get, right? That's huge. Also, those aerosols go all the way over to Miami. And so these aerosols we have to take into account, international transport of these aerosols. Also, as these, for example, if you have air pollution that comes from China, it's coming across the Pacific Ocean and impacting California, it's transforming and oxidizing and changing. So we have to understand how that chemistry occurs, because by the time it gets to the United States, it's transformed into something else, and we need to know what that something else is. Also, Canadian wildfires. When that wildfire is happening and you're right next to it, it's a whole different kind of aerosol than what we're exposed to in North Carolina. By the time those aerosols go up in the air and age in the sun all day, all night, and get to here in North Carolina, they're a much different aerosol than they were when they were immediately in. And we have to understand those transformations. So, and then your final question is, are we doing? Yes, we are doing work all over the world. So a lot of us are doing, I'm doing work in East Africa, done work in South America, the Middle East, Europe. There's campaigns in Asia and India. There are campaigns in East Africa. I mean, all over the world, because this is an international problem that we need to, and we have international collaborators all over the world trying to work on this problem. And you know what? These countries recognize that air pollution is a suck on the productivity of their country, because they have to spend more money on public health. There's less productivity from their folks, and they all recognize that and see it as hindering their economic prosperity if they don't get a handle on air quality.
So air quality usually it gets worse when it gets hotter. Why is that the case?
Not necessarily true. In some cases, it is true. Correct. So, for example, ozone. Typically, the high ozone seasons during the summer. That's because there's higher temperatures and more photochemistry, so a higher sun, which produces ozone, but also the trees are producing the most gases, and so that mixture allows you to make more ozone, right? Longer days, right? Hotter intensity. But you can also have bad air quality in the winter. So you can have a winter inversion. Folks who are in Alaska know about this, or in places in California. What happens is the ground gets super cold, right? And so the air, it cools down the air above it. And so that air is now cooler than the air above, which is warmer, and so it doesn't rise anymore. And so it traps all the emissions, right, in that shallow, what we call boundary layer. And so if you're winter and you're burning wood and you have a shallow boundary layer, we see very episodes of poor air quality as a result of that. So it can happen in the winter, it can happen in the summer, for different reasons.
This interview has been great. I don't even have a watch on. I only know for over time.
It's 35 minutes that we're at.
Oh, perfect, because I have a few more questions, right? All right, so have you ever seen, it's overused, there is a funny meme where a gentleman is walking with his partner, right? And a woman walks by. And he's like, he turns around, and he's like, ooh, like, almost like the grass is greener on the other side kind of thing, right? Sure. Is there like, if you're walking, right, with your particulate partner, right, your research field that you dedicated so much of your life to, right, and all of a sudden another field of science like walks by, what field of science like really like catches your eye? Like, if you were to do it all over again, is there another field of science that you would find yourself going into? And if that's not the right question, what other field of science out there is like, oh, that's a really cool field. I like to read up on that field.
Oh, that's a great question. I never thought about this before. Right? Wow, this is really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, you're still a faithful researcher, right? The PM community
still faithful,
is going
right?
to have you, but like, what other field out there is just like, oh man, that's a really cool field?
Yeah, well, I have to say I'm really content in the field that I'm in. I really enjoy doing it. I do look at other fields and I'm like, man, I'm glad I'm not there, and I'm glad I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But if I did have to switch, and I'd be something in music. It'd be like get a PhD in jazz or jazz studies or jazz history or something with jazz in Jamaica. That's what I would do.
I was not expecting that at all. I thought you were going to pick another field of research, but you picked like something. You picked
totally.
art.
Oh hell yeah, I would. My dream job would be, there's a guy, his name is Giles Pearson,
Okay.
And basically what he does is goes around the world, goes to record stores and buys records, and then puts a radio show of the stuff that he finds.
Oh, man, really cool.
That, or I would own a record store. That would be awesome. I would own a record store and have a little stage, like all day records here in Carver. It'd be like a dream, and I would just work at the record store. That's what I would do.
Oh man, that's awesome. I cannot act like I'm not familiar with that thought. When I started graduate school, by the way, it was wild when I walked in here and saw that neighbor from like when I first started graduate school. When I first started graduate school, I actually was a rapper, right?
Right on.
So I was, in the laboratory. So, I did work with like, mice and, viruses and so on and so forth. And when you work with like cell culture or live animal models, right, you can be, in the lab at all hours because you never know when something's going to happen. But sometimes I would leave the lab like late at night and then just go right to the club and like perform, right? Just,
amazing.
Like from the lab to the stage. Now, I don't think I was that good at all, but it was so much fun.
Yeah, that's it.
It was so much fun. And
that's
sometimes I would have some of my graduate colleagues, I guess, people in my cohort who didn't know that side of me. They would be there and they're like, what? So no, I completely get that. I completely get that. In fact, I think most scientists need to have some kind of art, outlet or whatever. So wait, are you a musician as well, or are you just a consumer?
No, I also play. I play in a traditional reggae ska band called The Unsustainables.
Okay.
We can find us on Spotify and all the music streaming services. We're also on theunsustainablesband.com. Check us out, The Unsustainables. Yeah, so I play bass. It's an 8-piece band. We've got a trumpet, trombone, saxophone, conga, drum, piano, guitar, bass. It's fun.
Yeah. You got to put some good things out into the air, right? Some
That's
good
right.
vibes out into the air. I feel you on that.
Yeah, if you dig the Rossman Vibrations, you can check it out. That's right.
Oh, man, that's really good. I used to listen to music all the time when I was, like, younger, but, like, now I just, like, listen to, like, interviews. I just keep up with sports, politics, science. That's just, like, consumed me. I just turn into an old man overnight, I feel like.
Oh, man.
But, I had to give a huge shout-out to Drake and Kendrick Lamar for pulling me back into music. Because I wasn't listening to anything until they started, their back and forth. We'll have to have a whole nother podcast on like the psychology and sociology of music or so on and so forth. I would say, if I were to do another field that I think is like really, really cool, it's got to be physics.
Mm-hmm.
This has got to be physics. I mean, I love virology, right? Virology is amazing. And obviously in this capacity of, doing these podcasts and, working with Carolina Science Cafe, I get exposed to just so many different types of science. But physics always blows my mind, right? Just to like, hey, listen, if you travel fast enough, like I interviewed somebody, a physicist here at UNC, right? And see if you can wrap your mind around this. She was talking about photons, which are particles of light.
Mm-hmm.
And they move so fast that they do not experience time.
Wow.
I don't even know what that means, right? They do not experience time. I guess the past, present, and future is just all a wash, and it's just, you can't even. It's concepts like that, I don't know, bring a lot of joy to my mind.
Wow, yeah.
If I can't go to sleep at night, I'm like,
Go for it.
what is a photon doing right now? What is a photon? Or Or it's like, they're even faster than a photon. You wouldn't know.
I don't know.
Black holes get me too. I like black holes, thinking about.
Oh, there you go. You got a second career for you.
No, I got to make sure this career works. Or I can just make sure I make a bunch of ribs and so on and so forth. So you were talking a little bit about, AI and so on and so forth, and obviously, people are, rightfully concerned about it, but they should also be hopeful for some of the things that you are mentioning. Once we kind of develop better models and are able to just be able to take in the complex milieu that is the air that we breathe. I mean, it's so complex that it's really hard to kind of wrap our hands around or wrap our minds around. But what kind of things can we do, right, with these new models, as you were talking about?
Sure. I mean, just recently there have been some discoveries that being exposed to aerosols increases frequencies of dementia and cognitive decline. We wouldn't have seen that if we didn't have exposure models to predict what people are being exposed to. We have the ability now to weigh in on new industries that want to locate or expand and use these models to decide whether that's going to impact the air quality negative and who that is going to impact the air quality negative. The understanding of these communities that are disproportionately exposed to air pollution came as a result of modeling and being able to predict where these pollution is. So understanding, and the better that we understand this, the better we're going to be able to assess who's exposed to, what we're exposed to, how to control those exposures. Also, if you look at climate, that's another huge one. And for us to predict the impacts of climate, we have to understand the energy balance of the atmosphere. And aerosols can either cool or heat the atmosphere depending on their composition, size, and where they are. And so our ability to predict and understand in the future and in the past where these aerosols are not only help us for public health, but is also a huge impact on climate and what's going to happen in our future climate.
So you were talking about different communities. Can you talk a little bit about the need for researchers themselves to come from different communities? I feel like that would be very, very useful. We always talk about the research being conducted in communities, but oftentimes it's people not of those communities coming in to do that research. So can you talk a little bit about the need for different communities to be represented within the research community?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And we're at a School of Public Health here at the University of North Carolina, and so our mission is to train the next generation of researchers interested in public health, interested in air quality. And so we engage in a lot of community-engaged research with counties in eastern North Carolina, Sampson County and Robeson County. I have ongoing projects right now. And then we also try to recruit folks from those areas to do research in those areas. And we've actually been pretty successful in recruiting some of those folks. And it's interesting because, I've been at this university now for, close to 20 years. And when I first started here, I would try to recruit a lot of Latinos that would be on campus, and most of those Latinos were immigrants from different countries. In the last 4 or 5 years, I continue, I'm involved in a big shout out to Carolina Latino Center here on campus and SLY and the things that I'm involved with here. A lot of these folks now are children of immigrants who've moved here to North Carolina, have raised these children here in North Carolina, and they were born in eastern North Carolina, they're born in Siler City, and now they're coming here to UNC as undergrads, and I'm grabbing them and training them and do a research on the counties and places where they're from. And I think that's an amazing opportunity for them, but also provides us a lot of value. Because when you're studying the environment and you're studying air quality, it's all about sources and communities, right? Where people are who are being exposed and where the sources are and what those activities of those sources are. And the best people who have knowledge of those communities are the people who live in those communities. The best way that we can get data about sources are from people in the community. Simple things like, those trail cameras? I don't know if you've seen these. Like people put these on the trails or outside when an animal goes by, it turns on, right? Yeah. We give those to communities, and they put those, and they watch trucks go by, right? They're always complaining about trucks, right? Well, now we have a camera. We can count the number of trucks.
Right.
We can then model what that person's exposed to, because now we have the data for those drugs. So, we wouldn't have that if we didn't have community engagement. So, yeah, having the community involved and training folks that can engage with those communities, and the folks who come from those communities know the problems of those communities. And that, when you're solving problems, identifying the problem is always the first step.
Shout out to Siler City, home of the Jets.
Yes.
There we go.
Paul Quadros.
Yeah, and also, it's always important to spend some time in areas you've never been before, because if you've never been to these communities, you might go in and say Robeson County or Robeson County, right? That's it, Robeson County. And I was like, wait, you're not from around here. So
Robeson, right?
Robeson, right? That's awesome. And huge shout out to you for doing this type of thing. I want to kind of get in a little bit of the need to, communicate science. We touched on it a little bit at the very, very beginning, right? First, talk about what's hard about communicating science. So you're good at it, but first talk about what's hard about it.
Oh man, what's hard about it?
What audience is the most difficult, right?
Oh wow, that's the second question. First off, what's hard about it? Yeah, I mean, it's a complex subject, right? It's hard for me to even understand it, and I've been looking at it for years and years, and there's things I still don't understand. I mean, there's plenty of things I still don't understand. I'm still learning. I mean, every day I learn something new, or learn something that I thought I knew and didn't know, right? Once I heard advice like, when you have your PhD, when you're done, when you recognize how little you know, and then you're ready to graduate, right? Like the recognition of what you don't know is super important. And so, trying to understand something myself that's difficult to understand, and then get it to a place where I can understand it enough that then I can communicate it to somebody else in a way that so the way I look at it is, I didn't understand it because the person who taught me didn't do a very good job. Right? And so why was there a challenge for me to understand this, right? Because it's not that people are dumb, right? It's just that the way that you communicate or how you deliver information wasn't done in a good way. And, I'm a smart person with a good background who has this, and I still didn't understand that concept. Is it because I didn't know? It's because of the way that it was taught. And so I deliberately try to think of ways of how to deliver information in a way that would make sense to me in a simplest way I can. And that's kind of how I approach those things. And yeah, I guess and then the hardest group. Yeah. Let's see. It would be other faculty. That would be the toughest guy.
Oh, really? I always thought it was I always felt like it was the exact opposite. No,
I take that back. Faculty are probably the second worst. The first worst would be politicians.
All right, yeah, okay.
And only because, because I don't like politicians, because the only reason is because the only people I know who like to hear themselves talk more than professors are politicians.
Oh, there we go.
And so they just talk, and they don't let you talk, and you're like, okay.
Well, it's kind of like the 3 Ps of people who like to hear themselves talk: preachers, politicians, and professors. Right?
That's it.
There we go. Right? There we go. That's just how it goes. It's weird because I always thought that, the exact opposite, right? Sometimes you would get in front of a department seminar, right? And you feel like, oh, I'm a nervous wreck. People are going to expose me, right? For the gaps in my understanding of my own work, right? But I realized that some things you don't even have to explain, because when you're talking to that group, you can just assume that they know it already. But it wasn't until I started communicating to community organizations that they start exposing the gaps, because they'll just ask just the most random questions that catch you off guard.
Those are the best, yep.
Yeah, and you're like, oh my goodness, now I recognize the gap. Or I'll have to explain something more than I would have if I was at a department seminar or something.
Oh, interesting.
Like that.
So for me, it's the opposite. So I like going to this community because I get these off-ball questions that allows me to kind of think of ways in new ways, and I find that exciting and thrilling. When I go to faculty meetings, it's just a grilling, man. They're just going to grill you, right? And good grilling. They're going to really make you think about things that in a different way. So I guess it's not really a challenge. I mean, I enjoy all those. It's just kind of a different. I have more fun. I guess that's the word I'm trying to look here. Yeah. I have more fun with non-faculty.
Yeah, I was probably worse. As a graduate student, I try to climb that social ladder by trying to catch a presenter up. Right?
Oh, wow.
You just try to ask a question, and you're like, oh, Richard. You're like, yes. I'm climbing the ladder by being the worst graduate student ever. No, it was just a lot of fun. It would keep me awake.
Sure.
You get that pizza, you get a slice of pizza, during the presentation and start dozing off. So I had to pay attention and talk, so on and so forth. All right, last but not least, we're going to leave it right here. Anybody at home who is going to tune into this and check this out, wherever you may be, whether you might be listening or watching or checking this out, Will, what would you like to leave with the folks at home that have listened to this presentation and now, wanting to kind of, improve their health, protect their families? What are some takeaways that you can leave for somebody listening to this?
Yeah, I think if you have anxiety about climate and anxiety about air pollution, the only way that's going to fix those things is collective action. And so get involved in some sort of collective action to move the needle on this. There are choices out there about how to go forward in either, for example, just take example for renewable energies, right? There's one where we have a path where we invest heavily in that, and we've talked about in this podcast.
Yeah.
We've talked about in this podcast how significant public health benefit we could have by just electrifying the transportation fleet.
That's right.
Right? And so there are stark choices out there about which way to go in that. And so think about that and join organizations and join collective actions that promote those sorts of things. And then we're going to have some real meaningful change.
Actually. One more plug for the Science Policy Action Network. Will, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
If you are a researcher and you are wanting to figure out a way to navigate the halls of D.C. or Raleigh or wherever you're going, trying to interact with the community or policymakers, look no further than the Science Policy Action Network Incorporated. They have your back. They are the best in the world at what they do. If you have that burning question or that research that you think is going to change everything, but you don't have the time, the capacity, or maybe you're a little nervous to interact with a policymaker or a politician, come to the Science Policy Action Network. We're happy to have your back. We're happy to support you. Again, huge shout out to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Undergraduate Library. Will's right here. Thank you so much. Check out his reggae and also support his research. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Yeah, glad to be here, man. Thanks. I had a great time.
Very fun. Take care.